radar is tricky because anything that was under the radar became on the radar if it was attractive over the past couple of years. So I don't want to say Charleston or Greenville or any of the small markets in the Southeast because those are not hidden gems anymore.
Right. We know about, yeah.
Markets that I think potentially could grow. I always want to look at interstate highway connectivity in airports. You want to look at a share of the population that's relatively young, that maybe still doesn't have enough, the homeownership rate is allowing them to, is low enough that it's allowing for mobility. You want to see some kind of job stability. And I'm not biased, but I do think Columbus, Ohio is still a market that has the potential to grow. I think Richmond, Virginia is a market that has a lot of it's close enough to DC, close enough to employment center. It has its own employment base. It has the interstate highway system. I think that market has some potential thinking further out. Portland is not under the radar in that you don't know it, but it's a market that didn't really boom like some of the other areas because there was some...
Which one? Which Portland?
Stigma about living in Portland, Oregon.
Oh, Oregon, yeah.
And so I think that market can still see a lot more growth relative to what it has seen. But again, I mean, even the Fayettevilles of the world have become on the map. So it's really hard to point to a market that didn't.
Tracy and I were there, and
construction
about
everywhere.
A year ago,
it was crazy.
Oh man, Fayetteville's nice. Yeah. But yeah, definitely not. And that answer was so much better than the ChatGPT answer about the next boomtown. It was so, Allie Wolf, thank you so much for coming back. That was such a helpful conversation. Really appreciate you coming back on Outlaws.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much, Allie. That was great.
That was really good. I love talking to Ellie so much. Just so much, like, I just find her to be really good at both big picture, like themes, but also knows so much granular, specific data that I always feel like I learn a lot from her.
No, there were a bunch of things that jumped out at me from that episode. One of them was this idea of the third option, which we're so used to talking about housing in terms of, like, you have two options, two binary options. You either buy a house or you rent.
Yeah.
And over the past year or two, because of high inflation, there was this argument that, like, oh, it's actually a way of protecting yourself from higher prices, from higher rent, if you go out and buy a house, get a mortgage. But there is that third option, which is you just opt out of the market entirely and say, you know what, rent prices are crazy, house prices are crazy, I'm going to move in with some roommates or move back with my family.
So should we split a house? Should we split a...
Honestly, this would save me a lot of money.
Same. There's another thing that she brought up that is one of these things that I've, like, wanted to do an episode on for a long time. Electrical components. If you go to the ISM manufacturing survey, there is a section in there on commodities in short supply, and there are not many left because actually most of the supply chain crises problems have, like, eased. But the longest number of consecutive months, the commodity that's been in short supply, electrical components, 30 straight months have been listed in short supply. The next most common is electronic components, 28 straight months. So this remains like this huge bottleneck to everything. And then when you think, like, layering on the Inflation Reduction Act and all these energy investments, et cetera, like, this is still this, like, and I don't think many people are talking about it, so I'm really glad that Allie brought that up.
Well, since we're on the subject of bottlenecks, this is something else that kind of jumped out at me from that conversation. It's the idea of, like, maybe what we are seeing is a classic bullwhip effect amongst the home builders themselves, because they know that time frames to complete construction have become much longer. They know that it takes a lot longer to get permits and things like that. So why not start now? And even if the market softens a little bit down the road, you'll be better prepared.
And I just think there was a question to Powell at the end of last year, and it was basically one of these questions like, what do you say to the person who wants to buy a house and you're jacking up rates, and what do you say to that first-time home buyer? And his answer was something like, yeah, it's not great that rates are going up. We acknowledge the pain, but this is a necessary step to bring basically some level of sanity back to this market. And I see no evidence that that's happened. If anything, it just seems even more crazy,
weirder,
more bullwhipping, more uncertain, more reasons for home builders to not be able to plan these different time frames, as you mentioned, with the sort of, like, the sort of just the longer cycle, the multi-year cycle for land acquisition. I do not get the sense that the rate hikes, whether good or bad, have done much to restore something that people would resemble a healthy housing market.
Well, also, if you're talking about inflation and, consumer power,
Yeah.
it seems like there is still a large bulk of those that own homes
Yes.
who just are not necessarily feeling any constraints at the moment. They would have gotten mortgages at relatively
Yeah.
low rates. Their home prices are still relatively high, and it feels like they have a lot of bargaining power still.
And all the boomers are going to move to the boomtown.
That too.
The boomtowns. It's like, they're all going to move to Phoenix and the places where their kids are. So awesome.
It always comes back to boomers.
It sure does.
We can end every episode of Odd Lots by blaming baby boomers for something. But shall we leave it there?
Let's leave it there.
All right. This has been another episode of the Odd Lots podcast. I'm Tracy Alloway. You can follow me on Twitter at Tracy Alloway.
And I'm Joe Weisenthal. You can follow me on Twitter at The Stalwart. Follow our producers, Carmen Rodriguez at Carmen Armin and Dashel Bennett at Dashbot. And check out all of the Bloomberg podcasts on Twitter under the handle at podcasts. And for more Odd Lots content, go to Bloomberg.com/oddlots. We post transcripts. We have a blog. We have a newsletter that comes out Friday. And for even more, check out our Discord where listeners and viewers are chatting 24/7 about all of these topics. We have a great real estate channel in there, one of the most active ones, all kinds of interesting stories getting posted from around the country and what's really happening in the real estate market. Go there and check it out. Thanks for listening.
Ooh.
Don't blame me. Whether it's risking a national default or driving banks to failure, it's got to be someone else's fault. This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David West. This week, economist Glenn Hubbard on the damage being done by the fight over the federal deficit. Deborah Lair of Edelman Global Advisory on what China stands to gain from U.S. turmoil.
How do they build relations either with the United States to keep those markets open, or can they find new markets?
And Catherine Judge of Columbia on whether we need all of those regional banks after all.
We're seeing very real questions about the regional bank business model.
This week, Global Wall Street was looking for someone to step up and take some responsibility, like for the failure of 3 major regional banks. And the former head of Silicon Valley Bank was there to help, as he found a host of culprits other than himself, like the Fed and social media.
I believe that SVB's failure was brought about by a series of unprecedented events.
But the chair of the Senate Banking Committee had a decidedly different view.
We know your banks were fatally mismanaged. The next obvious question is why? With a simple answer, the same answer we find to most questions about big bank failures, because the executives were getting rich.
And when it comes to the debt ceiling, Republicans and Democrats picked up the theme of pointing fingers at everyone but themselves for the risk of the United States flirting with reneging on its debt for the first time in 234 years. As President Biden has put the onus on Republicans, and Speaker McCarthy continues to point his finger at President Biden.
Do we have obstacles? Yes, we have a big obstacle in the White House.
But even as the two sides blamed one another, they did find some room for optimism.
Confident that we'll get the agreement on the budget, that America will not default.
But despite all the disagreement and the urgency, President Biden thought things were going well enough that he could head over to the G7 meetings in Hiroshima, Japan at the end of the week, though he did promise to get back by Sunday.
The nature of the presidency is addressing many of the critical matters all at once, so I'm confident we're going to continue to make progress toward avoiding default. However, I'm cutting my trip short.
Then on Friday, Morgan Stanley CEO James Gorman surprised Wall Street by announcing to shareholders that he would be stepping down as CEO within the next 12 months, raising